Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for today's interview. And before we begin, just a quick word. My guest has given me permission to mention that her voice sounds a little bit different. She's not nervous. She has a vocal issue called spasmodic dysphonia, but I hope you'll stay and listen. Sarah's insights are absolutely priceless, and she's helping a lot of people to think through a lot of issues related to the patriarchy, related to grooming, related to church abuse, relating to having a voice again and to healing and to just making sure that people are empowered and they're reclaiming their autonomy, which is a huge part of what this platform is all about on many levels as well. So I'm beyond honored to be interviewing Sarah Stankorb. And with that, we'll get into the interview. Thanks so much. Today, I'm speaking with Sarah Stankorb. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And Sarah, I just want to start by saying Sarah is one of my personal heroes. I am extremely honored to be speaking with you today. I've been reading your work for a couple of years, and you're one of my personal heroes. For a brief bio, Sarah is a renowned journalist. Her articles as a journalist have been featured in prominent publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vogue, The Guardian, Marie Claire, The Atlantic, and CNN Money, among others. She covers topics such as politics, the environment, health, technology, religion, and cultural commentary. She recently published a book, which we'll be focusing on a little bit here in a few minutes, called Disobedient Women, which is an awesome title, based on her extensive reporting on women who spoke up and exposed myriad abuses in evangelical communities and defied their church's expectations of submission and silence. She's also the author of a Vice article called Inside the Church that preaches wives need to be led with a firm hand about the ChristChurch cult led by Doug Wilson in Moscow, Idaho. And that's just to give you the professional bio first, but could you also tell us a little bit more about yourself and maybe something fun or one of your hobbies?
Oh, so hobbies are reading books. I'm pretty low key. Maybe I'm desperate here for something fun. This quilt behind me in the closet where I'm sitting, my grandmother made it. So it's soundproofing and a little bit of family history kind of
Mm,
over my shoulder.
that's awesome. It's very beautiful. Well, before we get into your book, I know that's the kind of the big thing on the radar these days, but could you just tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of your relationship to Christianity? Did you grow up as a Christian, or
Mhm.
how did your personal story evolve?
Yeah, so I was raised Presbyterian, USA, that version of Presbyterian, and United Methodist. And I was a pretty faithful kid. I had a pretty rocky childhood. My father was an alcoholic, and I found a lot of solace in God. But I was also a very curious child, and I did also read a lot of books as a kid and spend a lot of time in the religion section at the library. So I was always like checking out books about other faiths, learning whatever I could about anyone's theory of what there is out there. Um, and for me, that wasn't an issue. No one at my church minded if I asked questions about what if reincarnation is a real thing. They'd answer what they thought. Um, up until my teenage years, when I sort of fell in with a more evangelical crowd, not even very long, I say I was kind of sideswiped by that tradition, but it really affected the way I looked at how I should do faith. And suddenly there were rules, and suddenly I felt judgment in a way that I hadn't before. And from that, once I went to college, and I was also a religion major, read the Bible, read historical context for the Bible, and by then, because my faith had become so restrictive, it didn't have the room to expand again, and so it just broke. And for years, I called myself an agnostic, that I was an atheist. And I think now I'm more on the agnostic front. I just don't feel especially committed to any answer, nor do I think I have access to ultimate reality to make any specific claim.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you were in the evangelical community, did you make a profession of faith where like they were actually inviting you to actually trust Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and that his death and resurrection was on your behalf?
Yeah, a number of times, which I've learned is actually fairly common. The first time, which I mentioned in the book, was purely on accident. I thought I was flirting with a DJ at a church dance, and the music was loud. He held my hand. I thought I was being super smooth. And he had said a prayer and turned off the music and announced I had given my life over to Jesus. And from that
That's funny.
point on, now in hindsight, it's hilarious. At the time, I thought, what have I done? A few minutes of sort of mortal fib. Um, but it set me down this path where I kept questioning, am I really a Christian? Which that hadn't entered my mind as a worry up until then. And then it just sort of happened over and over. It was like I was trying to stick the landing on being a Christian the right way. And it
Mm,
just, I think it caused a lot of anxiety.
yeah. Now, when you mentioned going to college and so forth, that you just didn't have room to grow, was that
Mhm.
because of issues like learning about science and evolution or mythology, or what was it that your mind was expanding on that Christianity just couldn't hold you in anymore?
I think part of it, back in high school, I actually felt like I was getting a call to be a minister. And one of my good friends, gently pulled me aside and said, no, 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 no. The Bible says that women cannot have that role. We had a female minister, but yeah, and I was shifting into this restrictive worldview. So there was a bit of that. Um, we also, I went to a Christian liberal arts school, so there was a real tension on campus between looking at homosexuality through the eyes of science and the eyes of psychology and understanding people as people, and then on the other flank, what does the Bible say? And we had many like campus conversations. It was built into our first year curriculum to have these opposing views. There was an on-campus debate where the one openly gay friend I had and the first trans person I ever met were on a panel basically arguing for their equality and their humanity. So that was part of it. And within the Methodist Church before I went off, I had seen at a youth annual conference a lot of vitriol toward any just open welcome of gay people. And that was back when the idea was treating all sins as equivalent, still calling gay people sinners, but seeing the rage in the other youth and the way they use the Bible as a tool, that was all baked in. And then frankly, just reading the actual Bible and seeing verses that clearly were redacted together, and if you take both literally, it's inconceivable. Like they can't both happen. You cannot have two different creation stories. Starts on page one. So seeing that certainly shakes any impulse toward biblical inerrancy. So I had a lot of these things all happening at once.
Mm. Did you, at that point, since you were a Christian already at that point and you're thinking through those issues, did it feel painful to you to realize that maybe the afterlife was not there? Maybe it wasn't guaranteed. Maybe you don't go
Mhm.
anywhere when you die. Like, did you struggle with that, or how did you deal with the emotions of thinking, if this isn't truth, then I have a big gaping hole now of knowledge of what is ultimate
Mhm.
reality, and is there an ultimate reality?
Yeah, it was devastating for years. Um, I didn't know anyone who had been faithful like I had, and then had the bottom drop out in the way that it did. People didn't talk about deconstruction. We barely had the internet back when I was in college, so I didn't have a framework for it. and I just felt extremely alone. So alone in that like metaphysical sense. What is there? What is the universe? But also just I didn't know how to talk about what was happening. And that's one of the reasons why I think it is so helpful now that people do have these online communities where you're not restricted by geography. Geography really matters with things like this. That people are able to say, here's what I'm going through, and realize they're not completely isolated in it.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's amazing too, just that you mentioned the internet, how much it's changed all these discussions so much. And
Mhm.
I'm sure it's going to get even better as just more and more information gets more publicly available to everybody. When one of the things that I like to ask about, I know because of the sake of time, I'm kind of fast tracking some of my questions here, but I appreciate you let me do this to hear both your story, but also to get to your book in a few minutes. But I do want to ask a few more quick questions about your personal journey.
Mhm. Mhm.
One of the questions I ask a lot about is the contrast of peace that you had as a Christian versus the peace you had as a deconverted person. And I don't mean necessarily in the first week or two of deconversion where you're saying, I definitely don't believe that anymore. That's obviously a time of a lot of chaos. But like as you get grounded, as you're kind of reclaiming your identity and getting settled and creating new roots and even some new community, hopefully, eventually, once you're kind of back in your own, healthy spot as a deconverted person, what was the peace like then versus the peace that you had as a Christian?
That's a fascinating question. Um, I think it's actually fairly similar. Now I'm talking 20 plus years out. So really a quarter century out is how long it's really, I think, taken for me to feel completely at peace. Um, Before I kind of bumped into evangelicalism, the faith that I had was full of wonder and a lot of questions. So it was comfortable in a lot of ways. And now I ask questions for a living and talk to people about their experiences. And and I don't feel forced into any particular worldview. So I think it was a long road to get back to where I started from. It looks different. I have different um assumptions about what's out there, but I'm still kind of equally unsure, but open to asking whatever questions that I can think of.
Hmm, I love that. And it seems like for a lot of us that the peace even just event as again, once you kind of get settled, it eventually even supersedes and is larger than the peace you had as a Christian because you just realize you were so shackled and you weren't really yourself. And I use that illustration from the Matrix a lot, where you're like your eyes are open for the first time, where Neo's using them once he's escaped the Matrix, and it's like it's painful at first, but you realize at least you have some time to be yourself and to be safe in your own skin and to not have this mythology as a worldview, kind of keeping you into this construct. But I love
Mm-mm.
how the world changes for the better for us when we leave these worldviews. I was curious, kind of moving to your work. You kind of foreshadowed this with your talking about the gender roles, if you not being able to be in ministry as a pastor in your church. But and it's interesting how that's happened so early in your life, and it eventually became part of what you do. But how did you actually get from that point and from these experiences to wanting to be involved in writing about it and researching it? And was there any, like, what kind of early pushback did you get from people who might have said, be careful, you're stirring up a hornet's nest if you go too far down this path?
Mm. So in the world of journalism, hornets' nests are sometimes welcome. So um, I I think so. I studied religion in college. I went to University of Chicago Divinity School for graduate school, and I think all of those years were me sort of still processing what I was. I was giving up and what I was still seeking out in the world. Um, Years on, once I was reporting, I kind of wasn't thinking much about religion, honestly. I had felt like that was something I put behind me. Um, but I was working on a business story for a crowdfunder, and the crowdfunder, the man who was one of the founders, sent me an email and said, "We have the most interesting crowdfunding happening right now. I don't know, I you study religion, maybe you'd be interested." And it was for Vicky Garrison, who was at that point running the website, no longer quivering. And she had been a quiverfull mom. She had gobs of children. She had left her community. She had no money. And I thought, what is this? I had never heard of Quiverfull. I did not watch the Duggars on TV. I had no frame of reference, but I had a question. And then from there, I started with that story, researched as much as I could to understand her world. And that kind of bumped me into wanting to research some other idea I had discovered called stay-at-home daughters. That became another story, and that's this snowball that has, for well over a decade, kind of just taken over my writing life, because with each story, I either find a new question that I don't know how to answer, or a whole gamut of texts that are part of someone's belief system that I've never heard of. And I just roll into that, and it just keeps building.
Hmm. When you started to do that, did you have people in authority in churches telling you to back off at all?
No, no. I will get emails saying, "I notice you have children. Your children will go to hell with a mother like you." Pleasant, wonderful emails from people highly concerned about my spiritual welfare. But the pastors don't really bother with me. Journalists, thanks to the rhetoric in the last few years, conservative religious leaders are sort of seen as a lost cause by a lot of people, an object of scorn, but they don't bother to warn objects of scorn.
Hmm. Gotcha. I was curious. You've done some work regarding ChristChurch in Moscow, Idaho.
Mhm.
I've done several interviews. I'll be doing a lot more over the next few months from people who've escaped that group and that cult. A lot of damage going on there. For anyone who
Mhm.
doesn't know ChristChurch or Doug Wilson or Logos School or all that stuff and just what's going on culturally in Moscow, Idaho, could you give a brief summary of what you've observed and what you think is happening there?
That's difficult for me. I feel like I'm about to turn into a firehouse. Um, so I think a good intro to Moscow is knowing that Doug Wilson, who many people outside of Christianity or watched our groups don't really know his name. He's a figure who runs a publishing house. He runs a school. He runs a pastor's training program. He runs a very small college. But Christ Church itself is also within this small town, established in a way that it stakes out territory. So stakes out territory in terms of real estate, um, but it also stakes out territory culturally within the community. So people who are a part of Christ Church really at the beginning feel supported, they feel loved, their children go to the school, maybe they move there for college, they feel like I'm part of a culture, a Christian culture that is resisting many of the things that I'm worried about in the external world. So it has this sense that you're winning the culture war. And what we see more broadly in terms of Christian nationalism happens in this small town. Now, within that community, because it's so tightly knit, there's also extremely high control. And that runs the gamut from advice that people hear in counseling or through Wilson's books in terms of women being submissive to their husbands, to the abuse that that fosters, to the abuse that gets excused, and there's that element. There's also, once you're in, the danger of speaking up is so real because you're cloistered in this subculture, and when you leave, you are cut out. You're done. Your name may appear in the bulletin, so people know exactly who you are and that you're cut out. If you run a small business, those people who now want nothing to do with you will quit going to your business. There's an economic toll to speaking up. And so that tension, it's so difficult to overcome. And for the people who are being hurt within that community, not only are they running up against the social costs, but all of their spiritual training tells them that what they're experiencing is normal and right. So to be able to see past both of those things is incredibly difficult and incredibly scary, let alone all of the other costs of destabilizing your family, which makes it difficult for any abuse survivor to leave. It's this wraparound that in a lot of ways I think is a warning to people outside of Moscow. This is what Christian nationalism can look like. This is what dominionism does. And it's heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah. I didn't directly grow up under Doug Wilson's tutelage in any sense, directly or indirectly, but I did grow up reading his magazine, which was Credenda Agenda. I don't know if they still publish new ones, but they used to be out every month, Credenda Agenda. And then he also has a blog called Blog and Mablog. At least that's what last time I saw it was called that. But I've seen articles in there that he's written where he is extremely aggressive and nasty to people, especially people who are either anti-complementarian, where there any kind of sense of if feminism creeps in at all,
Yeah.
and he's really aggressive against gay people, where it's just beyond unprofessional, beyond rude, beyond obnoxious. They take this perspective that they really need to be very militant, and I know even Doug's father, who is passed, he had written a book about how to take basically military tactics and use it for evangelism, but also the broader scope of Christian nationalism. It seems like Moscow is a microcosm of the Christian nationalist agenda and what they want to do maybe on a national scale. Why do you think people can't see someone like Doug, especially Christians, but why can't people see what Doug's doing and just see how offensive he is? Like, why is he a champion that people, in any other context, if he was doing these things in a corporate environment, any other environment, they would say, oh my gosh, this guy almost, should be in prison for what he's doing. He should certainly not be someone that we're looking up to. And yet they kind of treat him as a hero. How do you think people are getting sucked into that perspective?
So one of the women I interviewed for the book, and I think she was playing off of scripture, but she said Wilson says things that tickle itching ears. People, I think part of it is the fact that Christianity as a whole has lost so many numbers. There's this element of feeling that domination is slipping away, that at least cultural majority slipping away. So I think for folks who enjoy that feeling of being the majority, that is upsetting. That is something where you feel like you're losing, and for some, when you're losing, you want to fight, and you want a strong man on your side. I think in a lot of ways, it's also it's incongruous with what we expect from a pastor. It's definitely not what you would expect from someone who preaches social justice. And so it's a marker of difference. It's similar to what we saw with Mark Driscoll, or still are seeing someone like Mark Driscoll, where that personality of being the fighter, being the guy who says all sorts of words you never would hear from a pastor, and on the attack, it's so different that it gets your attention. And then if you feel like you're losing, or at least like you want to win a larger battle, having that general figure at the lead, I think that really speaks to a lot of people. also it justifies beliefs that people have. And people do sometimes have ugly beliefs. But if you can point to an authority figure, someone who's respected, someone who's written so many books that he published himself, that it justifies the ugliness that you're not totally comfortable with, but maybe you could be and are increasingly comfortable with when you have a figure like that.
Yeah. When you look at people across as maybe the scope from everyone from Doug Wilson up to Donald Trump and beyond, how serious of a threat do you think Christian nationalism is going to be in the next 10 to 15 years?
Oh, absolutely. So I started doing a bit of research on the New Apostolic Reformation and really talking to folks who lived within like an individual ministry or in a community led by one of these prophets. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with NAR, if that's a topic you've covered, but it's attached, it's kind of grown out of the Pentecostal charismatic movement. And a lot of the folks who are giving prophecies about Donald Trump are within that fold. But for the people, I think we've heard a bit about NAR on a national scale. We've seen politicians share quotes from prophets and justify their own political ascent. So there's that. But I'm also very interested, like, hey, I'm with Moscow and what it's like to exist underneath a power in a personal way. And the abuse that you see from a very high controlling pastor is basically, from what I've found so far, can be equal or worse when the person with authority over you claims to be a prophet, claims to be someone speaking directly with God's words. Um, and it's that can happen communally, but also has been adopted by many figures running for state level or higher office. That's, yes, I'm very, very concerned.
Thank you. Sort of a segue question to the last main topic of the interview, which is, of course, your work, your book, but transitioning from the ChristChurch environment, a lot of the issue, it seems like, for a lot of women as they realize the abuses that are happening, is that they're, of course, starting with patriarchy, how it's taking away their autonomy, starting with spiritual autonomy, but even going into physical autonomy. I've heard some stories sort of, woven in, and you can't always necessarily get people to publicly state that this happened, but you hear these stories of even them defending marital rape in these groups where you're never trespassing in your own garden,
Yes.
so to speak. And they see their husbands as a spiritual mediator, and that they cannot be disobedient, to go to your book's title. They can't be rebellious. They cannot come to different conclusions on spiritual matters, and in some cases they can't even vote differently. The men are saying, you women, you have to vote like your husband.
Yeah.
The women don't feel like they can own their own faith. They're being groomed to be subjugated, and in many cases these women are glad to do that. Could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the dynamics of these conversations behind the scene, where women are starting to say, maybe this actually is a lot less biblical from some of their perspectives. As an atheist, I don't care what's biblical, but for some of them, they're saying maybe it's not biblical. Maybe egalitarianism is where we want to move to. But overall, regardless of that topic, just saying this is toxic and we're not healthy. And maybe that realization, as so many of us have, that are we really sure we want to give this culture and this worldview to our daughters or the next generation, to our sons? Is this something we want to pass on? And them saying, thankfully, this is actually quite unhealthy. What are some of those conversations that are happening, and how hard is it for those women to be brave enough to speak up and actually buck the system?
Yeah. So the issue of marital rape and the sense that a married man has full rights over the body of his wife is actually far more common than I ever would have anticipated. There's also a sense kind of within broader evangelicalism that if there is an issue with the marriage, or if you've even had a fight, You need to be sexually available to your husband. You need to do that both to fix things, but also in order to keep him from lusting for someone else to prevent adultery. So it puts a lot of pressure on women's bodies, and it evaporates any idea of consent. So you have both of these happening at once. In those relationships, frankly, until he gets to the point where a woman doesn't feel like she can survive anymore, and they usually don't have words for what is happening. They don't call it rape. They talk about how they the violence done to their bodies, and sometimes these are violent rapes. Maybe they talk to their pastor, and the pastor says, that's marriage. Keep being available, pursue him. Maybe it will happen this way, which it puts the onus back on the victim of violence, sexual assault. Um, and the women that I've spoken to who have gotten out, they either got to a breaking point where they didn't want to live anymore. And so that they were in an act of desperation and told someone, um, or they heard in some way, whether through the internet or a close friend who wasn't from their church, and that's rare to find once you're in one of these churches, or through one of these advocacy groups. Just here's what domestic violence is. It's just so you have a definition. Here's what you're describing to me might be marital rape. What do you think? Like, here are some words. In a lot of ways, it's a function of lack of vocabulary for the abuse that they are enduring. They don't know it's abuse. They think it's what God ordained in their relationships. And so escaping that, like that matrix paradigm shift you were talking about in terms of what's real and what isn't, they have to go through that in order to even recognize that the way they feel is related to the abuse that they are living through. And that's incredibly hard to go through. And there's also like a head shaking disbelief once they're on the other side. Like, how did I accept this? How did I live like this? Um, and usually then the guilt falls back inside instead of outward, where it belongs on the people who normalized the hell they lived through.
With the going back to the word patriarchy for a second, do you see
Mhm.
women who are quite happy to defend it in your interviews at all, or they're just like, actually, there are some issues, but I want men to be in charge? And we all have seen that traditional picture of it's God, Jesus, the church, the elders, the husband, and so forth. Do you think that a lot of women in these groups are just putting up with it because it's what they're used to, it's just their cultural background? Or do you think a lot of women are truly like, no, I really want a man to lead me in all these areas, I truly want to subjugate myself to them, and that's the best life, is to be subservient in these ways?
So the model of subservience isn't always as clear cut as it seems. So sometimes the idea of headship is brought home by the woman. Like, she went to a homeschooling conference, she got a stack of books. Here's what God wants, and she kind of forces it on her husband, which is a complicated mental maneuver. So it can come from a place of wanting to do the right thing, but the power dynamic isn't as clear as it is in those graphics. But for sure, there are women who maybe aren't at the pinnacle. Maybe they won't get the head of church, but they garner personal power by working well within the system. And you'll have that in any institution. But the pastor's wife, for example, may never get to be the pastor, but among the women in the church, she may hold a whole lot of authority, and she may be able to wield that authority. And I have spoken to women after the fact who are just baffled by how they ever could have participated in something that also made them at the bottom, but they at the time did feel like they had some sort of personal benefit. Like this is as good as it could get for me. So here I am. I'm a beloved homeschool mother that a lot of other moms look up to. And there's a bit of a reward there, despite all of the other issues she may be having. So it's complicated. Um, and I don't think it would continue to succeed if there weren't at least some bit of benefit for some women, certainly not all.
Yeah, I guess there's something to be said to the idea that if you grow up in it, it's what you're always used to, and you're sheltered, and everyone around you that appears to be healthy and godly is doing it. It's like why go outside that box?
Yeah.
Just to wrap up, I did want to ask for your going back to your book. Could you give maybe one or two big goals that you had with the book, and maybe also bring into that the context of for anyone that's watching our interview and your interviews in general. And by the way, we thank you so much for just what you're doing for the community. You're please don't stop. we need you so badly. But for those of us that are maybe less informed, less educated about these issues, could you include maybe a word or two of exhortation to say, like, if you don't know that it's this serious, you need to start studying this and this, get informed so that you can start being part of these discussions and change the culture. So if you could just tell us your goals and what we can do to be more informed and involved.
Yeah. So truly, I think my top goal was that now there are all these popular podcasts giving plenty of accolades to the people who spoke out against these abusive pastors. And invariably, I would listen to these podcasts, and it would be men who were part of the church, or it's always men. And for many, many years now, I've been following the women who were at the fore, posting about problematic theology, posting about these stories that they were hearing that no one else was listening to, and spelling out all of these problems. And now that the ground is quaking, and there is a bit of a reckoning, not a full reckoning, but a bit of a reckoning. I just wanted these women to get some stinking credit for the incredibly difficult labor they've been doing for free, just to try to help people survive their churches. So to me, that was number one. Number two, I do hope that through reading the book, people who are maybe appalled about Christian patriarchy, but never really considered how homophobia and racism and false authority, which is a major issue, and all this, how all those pieces are interconnected, also with things like Christian nationalism. And I hoped to show it isn't just one concern, all of it's baked in together. So for me, that was key. For folks just entering this world, it can be a little spiky, but that's why I like it. There, one of the blogs I wrote about is called Wartburg Watch, and if you just want like every few days glimpse into what's going on in some of these communities, that's a very good blog to follow. In terms of books, I wouldn't start with Jesus and John Wayne. Maybe it makes book 2 or book 3. But I think the woman they wanted, which just came out by Shannon Harris, who is married to Josh Harris, author of I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and pastor of Covenant Life Church years ago. Her book is very personal. It's a memoir. It's almost lyrical in its writing, and it lets you feel what it's like to be plunged into one of these roles where you are supposed to be the submissive woman and fit a mold. And then I think from there, the Making of Biblical Womanhood by Beth Allison Barr is also it has elements of the personal, but it also has loads of history that I think will help people rethink the way that they interpret certain verses about women in the Bible, and it's incredibly helpful. So that's where I would go. My answer is always books. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just wanted to say, I know we've mentioned a lot of different resources. I'll have all the links beneath this video for that. So please go check out the book. Again, the new book that we're talking about is called Disobedient Women. I'll have the Amazon link for that. So please go support Sarah that way. I'll have the link to Sarah's website, to the Warburg Watch, and anything else we've mentioned here. But Sarah, I just want to say thank you so much. Your voice is so precious to so many of us who've been trying to, be involved in this, be more educated and be more concerned, and also be more available to people who are escaping, that need our support and also need platforms to share their story eventually when they're ready. But thank you so much. I love hearing your story. I'd love to interview you again, especially as you, I'm sure, produce more books and articles over the next few years. But thank you. You're one of, again, I'll finish where I started. You're one of my heroes. You're one of the heroes of many people that I work with. So thank you for what you're doing and who you are.
thank you. Thanks so much.
Absolutely.